Good evening. It's good to see everybody this evening. Glad to see everybody here. My podium is on its way, so I'm going to stall for a minute. Could we go ahead and have some prayer requests and maybe say a word of prayer before we get started tonight?
Sandra Morris is still in Centennial Hospital.
Yeah, if you didn't receive the message from the church yesterday, Sandra Morris has been in the hospital for several days and has not been able to come home. She's still there. She came home today. Okay. She's on her way home as we speak. Okay, well that's good news. That is very good news. All right, good deal. So we want to remember her, of course, in our prayers.
Tina's sister Martha will be buried tomorrow.
Yeah, that was announced as well. Yep. Anyone else? Oh, that's too bad. And so he's still in Memphis, the Lebanon. Chandler Robertson was his name? Yes. So, anyone else? Anyone else have any prayer requests for us today? Okay, why don't... Oh.
Sorry, my brother and sister-in-law both got diagnosed with COVID yesterday, so.
Roman said his brother and sister-in-law
Yeah, he's okay, she's having
have COVID now. And we're starting to see those cases on the rise again. So I think after the holidays especially, we're going to see an uptick because of all the travel and people spreading things around to different parts of the country.
Mark Montgomery said they were doing better. They had COVID.
Yeah, Mark and Stephanie Montgomery, continue to remember them. I think their whole family has been down.
They're out of quarantine.
Okay. Are they here tonight?
She's supposed to be here.
Okay. I haven't seen either of them tonight. Anyone else? Okay, let's pray then. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us another day of life and an opportunity to study together tonight, to uplift one another and encourage one another by studying your word together. We're grateful for this church and the faith of each member. We ask that you will bless us with success as we embark upon a new year coming soon. We ask that you will help us to make the right decisions that not only honor your word and your will, but also enhance the faith of every person here. We're grateful for this avenue of prayer so that we can bring petitions to you for people who are hurting, people we know, people we're related to. And we ask that you will be with all of those who have been mentioned here tonight. We're grateful for the good announcement that Sandra Morris is on her way home and her recovery. We're also mindful that many people have lost loved ones and are hurting or ill in some sort of way. We ask that you will be with every situation and only in the way that only you can. Be with us as we think about the book of Jonah tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we're looking at Jonah chapter 2. That's where we ended up last time, you might recall. And we got as far as that first bullet point on the screen. We were talking about the afterlife. And we said in Jonah chapter 2, what we have is a poem. Jonah believes that he has entered into the afterlife. He's entered into Sheol. Now, of course, that's not the case. Where is Jonah? In the belly of the fish or the whale or whatever it may have been. Jonah is in the belly of this sea creature. He is not, in fact, in Sheol, but the psalm that he utters in chapter 2 goes back and forth between this despair because he thinks he's dead and this realization that he's not, in fact, dead and that God has saved him and spared his life. And so we see this throughout this poem, and there are actually a couple of cycles of that structure we see. So let's go back to the beginning of verse 1 here. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. So the author tells us he was in the belly of the fish, but Jonah says in verse 1, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. The King James uses the word hell there. And you heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. And so the first cycle of despair and then realization is verses 1 through 4. And just to review what we said about Sheol last time, most simply, Sheol just simply refers to the afterlife. It's where you go when you die. It does not distinguish too carefully between a good side and a bad side, or between righteous and unrighteous. Everybody goes to Sheol. Okay, so we said that. Another thing that we said is that Sheol is sometimes personified, where it is a character described as a person in the Old Testament. Kind of like, we talked about verses where it says like Sheol opens its mouth to swallow, that kind of thing. And then the third thing we talked about is that God has the ability to deliver people out of Sheol. Remember that God can take people from that place. So God has power even in Sheol. So let's talk about this realization. Notice in verse 4 the word yet marks the transition between the despair with Jonah thinking that he's dead and then the realization that he's not in fact dead but that God has spared his life. And so he says, yet I shall look upon your holy temple. What does the temple represent in the Old Testament?
God's presence.
Okay, so What was Jonah trying to do at the beginning of the book when he went to Joppa to board a ship going to Tarshish? Right. And the Bible does say that, actually explicitly, that he was trying to flee from the presence of the Lord. And so here, Jonah comes to the realization that not only is he still alive, but that he will once again be able to look upon the presence of God in the temple. And so kind of he's come full circle, so to speak, in this situation. Notice in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 38 through 40, the Bible uses the temple as an object to which the children of Israel can pray. This is an ancient custom. You might be aware that Muslims today, they say their prayers throughout the day. What was it, 3 times a day or whatever? I wish I knew more about Islam than I do. It's an area where I need to study more. But they pray like a bunch of times during the day, I think. But they pray toward, anybody remember? Mecca. Right. So if you are on one part of the planet, you pray one way. If you're on another part of the planet, you pray another way, because geographically they pray towards the city of Mecca. Now that's a really ancient custom in the Near Eastern world. When Daniel is in Babylonian exile, he prays toward Jerusalem, you see. Now, at Daniel's time, the temple had been destroyed, but that's probably a custom we can see already in Jonah's day, that people, no matter where they may have been, they prayed toward the temple, and it's biblical. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 38 through 40, whatever prayer, whatever plea, this is God speaking, is made by any man or by all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward this house, the word house in this context refers to the temple, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways, for you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. And so here, Solomon, by inspiration, speaking for God, says, when people pray toward the temple, God, you can hear them, and based on their lives, whether or not they're sincere, whether or not they've actually repented, you will forgive them of their evils. And so the temple is associated with the presence of God, even though a person is not at the temple physically in Jerusalem, they can pray towards the temple and get the benefits of God's presence among His people. Is that kind of cool, or what? I think it's kind of neat that that's the case, So the children of Israel didn't have to be at the temple offering sacrifices in order to get God's attention. Just by praying towards the temple, according to this passage, they could receive God's care. Any thoughts or follow-up on that concept? The temple is far more than a building. In fact, maybe we should say the temple really isn't much of a building. As beautiful and splendid as it was in its construction, its symbolic value is far greater than its material value, it seems. All right, then. Verses 5 and 6 of Jonah chapter 2. So this is the second cycle of despair and realization. So, the waters closed in over me to take my life, he says. The deep surrounded me. The weeds were wrapped about my head, which tells us, I think, if we don't stretch the poetic metaphor too far, that Jonah sunk a pretty good ways down into the sea before this sea creature came and swallowed him up, interestingly enough. Yes?
Before we get too far,
Okay.
something that jumps out that, I don't know, got my attention. In verse 3, he's acknowledging to God that he's the one that cast him into the deep.
Yes.
In reality, those men cast him
Right.
into the deep, right?
Yeah, good point.
So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Now, let's go back and look at chapter 1. Yeah. The men in verse 14, they pray, "Lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So maybe there's a correlation between those two ideas, interestingly enough. But it does tell us that God did not blame the mariners for throwing Jonah overboard. Yeah, interesting. Anything else there?
You think he'd come to the realization that God is in charge of everything?
Yeah, I think he may have come to that realization actually even before he was thrown overboard. Yeah, because I told you, I changed my view. I always thought that Jonah repented in the belly of the fish. But after studying this a few weeks ago in preparation for teaching, I actually think he repented on the ship when he saw the storm.
Yeah, because he asked him to throw him over, and it will help
Yeah.
get rid of the calm sea.
Yep. All right, so verse 6. At the roots of the mountains I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Notice in both cases you have sort of this resurrection language, that Jonah has a new life. He will look upon God's temple. And in this case, God has raised him from the pit being, of course, a symbol for death. It's used oftentimes in relation to Sheol in the Old Testament. You have Sheol and then you have the pit. They're used interchangeably. So Jonah dramatically depicts drowning here. And like we said, he talks about the weeds being wrapped around his head. And if this is a literal understanding, not some kind of symbolic description of what it would mean to drown, then it tells you that Jonah actually hit the bottom of the sea. Now, we don't know how deep the sea was. Certain parts of the Mediterranean, I'm quite confident, are several miles deep. Certain parts are shallow enough where you can dive them today. Archaeologists do all the time, in fact, in this area. A lot of shipwrecks have been discovered. What's that?
How far the sun can penetrate in the water to generate the weeds.
Oh, that's a good point. So how deep is that?
I know one lake, 40 feet, you could see, you could get weeds there.
Huh, interesting. So 40 feet?
Well, that's my interpretation.
That sounds like a question for Mr. Google. I don't know the answer to that. I never even thought about that. But that may give you sort of an idea about how deep this ship may have been whenever he was thrown overboard. Because, you know, you're not having weeds grow 2,000 feet deep, right?
Probably not.
Yeah. Huh. Well, if somebody comes up with some wisdom on that from, you know, the almighty internet, let us know. It'd be interesting to know. But notice that Jonah comes to the realization here that he has in fact been saved and that God has rescued him from the depths, from drowning, which of course is not only symbolic of the power of God, but also the fact that you have a number of psalms that speak in terms of despair in a person's life. Feels like you're drowning. I'm thinking of Psalm 69. You know, save me, O God, because the waters have come up to my neck and I'm screaming and I'm choking. And the psalmist depicts himself there. It's symbolic, but he depicts himself as being underwater, screaming for help, and nobody seems to hear him. And so there is sort of a biblical poetry history of describing a really bad situation in terms of drowning. Now, Jonah here, we understand it's probably a literal understanding of what's going on, but still interesting. Any thoughts on that or comments? Yeah.
Just one hit, so I haven't verified, but it's up to 200 meters.
Up to 200 meters. So do the math for me. So about 4 feet?
600 feet.
All right, so about 600 feet then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's pretty deep. I don't think I would want to try to swim up from 600. That's right.
I would think I was definitely drowning and fixing to make my maker drop.
Oh.
The size of whatever creature that swallowed him is going to be pretty large enough that he can swim around in however deep the water is.
Yeah, that's true. So it's not going to be like 7 feet.
He talks about being at the root of the mountains.
Yeah. Now the mountains, of course, and this is, of course, the kind of language of mythology in the ancient Near Eastern world, because the taller a structure is, the deeper its foundations need to be, right? So you look at how tall mountains are, what stands to reason that their foundations have to be really deep too. And so they had this visual image of the world where Sheol was in the world. Like we think of like heaven and hell as being in a different dimension of existence, right? But in the Hebrew Bible, they think of like the heavens and the earth and everything being like enclosed in this globe of sorts. And so Sheol is at the bottom. All right. Then above that, you've got waters. Because what do you know? If you drill down deep enough, no matter where you are, you're going to hit water. And so what do the seas represent? Well, in the Hebrew mind, that's like a fast access to the afterlife. Right? Because if you go down far enough, where are you going to go? Sheol, because it's at the bottom, you see. And so the mountains are grounded in those subterranean waters. And so like they had a very different view of the world. And you think about it, I mean, they didn't have geology and they didn't have the various sciences and physics and things. And so it kind of makes sense. And so whenever you looked up at the sky, they viewed the sky sort of as this gel-like structure with stars sort of planted in it. And God dwelt somehow, somewhere above all that. They didn't exactly know where, but he was up there somewhere. Okay? Even Aristotle, right? His view of the universe is it was this series of spheres that rotated one upon the other. That's how he explained the planets moving, the stars moving, because they were in different spheres. So what we sing, like in our hymns, anybody ever, the spacious firmament on high, you know this old song? It's a really hard song. It's a beautiful song, but it has the line, the music of the spheres. Have you ever heard that language? Okay, that comes from Aristotle. And it's filtered through Christian theology where it's a very physical view of everything. Anyway, I digress. But it's an interesting subject to think about how different people viewed the world, and it's largely by what do you notice when you stand and look up? What do you notice whenever you go down as far as you can go? They kind of deduce from that that's what the world is like. And so there has to be some kind of protective barrier over Sheol. And so that's where the concept of the bars came in and all this business. Interesting.
Going back a little bit from what you were talking about a while ago about Sheol and listed thought of as a man or whatever. Sometimes in some movies or publications they show death as a man.
Yeah.
With
Like Grim Reaper.
blood,
Yeah.
Grim Reaper and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that the things that scare us most are usually personified because when you make them into a person, you can define them and understand them better. So you think about it. That's basically everything that scares us or that intimidates us is personified in some sort of way. It's just a very common feature of humanity. In order to understand something, we make it like us. That's probably also the thinking behind the origins of idolatry. To make God like us, we can understand Him better. Because the fundamental problem with God is you can't understand Him. So how do you understand Him? Well, you get to define who He is, and then you understand Him. That's simple. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, I want to go on to the next part here. So this is in verses 7 through 9, where he realizes his salvation. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. And what we said before, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And then I'll just do verse 10 for good measure. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. And so what we see here is that the power of prayer is demonstrated in verse number 7. Jonah says that, I know you saved me. I know you didn't take my life. Now, by the way, does he know he's in the belly of this fish, this sea monster? What do you think? Does he know that? That's my answer too. It doesn't seem to me like he actually knows where he is. But somehow God has spared his life. What he seems to be thinking, yeah.
What did he think when the fish spit him out on the valley?
Well, I'm guessing at that point he realized where he had been. At this point, I'm not sure that he does. Actually, what would he think? My mind wouldn't think anything, right? Yeah.
My question is, when was this written? If Jonah wrote it, and I believe he did based on what I've heard.
Okay.
If he wrote it, did he write it after the fact? Which means all this that he wrote is what he did in his mind or whatever. So when he wrote this, he was already alive outside of the fish or whatever. So
But these were the thoughts he had.
it's sort of like writing a history of his experience of trying to run from God.
And telling you what he thought in real time.
Right.
Well, also, it's the fact that there's acid in, I would imagine, in some form for the fish to digest.
Remember, God prepared the fish. We talked about that at
that's
length.
right, that's right.
So
That's right.
whatever normal processes would have led to Jonah's digestion or Jonah's being digested, I would think that those had been postponed or suspended.
He did have fish.
Yeah. I don't know. Jonah seems to be quite terrified at this point with the fact that he's in the afterlife. So God is anyway going to save him. So he talks about verse 7. Let me just go through this here. He talks about the power of prayer. And one of the things that I want to notice, this is obvious to all of us, but suffering does promote prayer, doesn't it? Have you ever found yourself in the midst of a really terrifying situation? Maybe you're going in for some tests, or maybe somebody you love is going in for some tests, and you pray more often and maybe even more fervently than you would at other times, because suffering makes us more prayerful. It's one of the good things that always emerges from suffering, is that very thing.
Prayers are related to the problem. And a lot of times you don't have the problem, you just pray in general, probably,
Yeah.
for other people. And then when you have something that's there, you're actually focusing on that problem.
Okay, so another thing is prayers become more specific in the midst of suffering, whereas maybe you don't pray any more often, but you pray more specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. Any other thoughts on that?
They definitely become more intense.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed, I just wrote this down, with some people, the more they suffer, the less they pray, because they blame God for their problems. But with godly people, the more they suffer, the more they pray. And we see this in a number of cases. I actually gave an example from Hebrews 5 because it's one that came to mind for me, thinking about Jesus. And I don't know that Jesus was ever a person who didn't pray regularly, but notice how Hebrews 5 describes his prayers. This is in the midst of his suffering, preparing for the cross. Hebrews 5 verses 7 through 9. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Now, there are a few things that are interesting to me about that passage. Number one, that suffering led Jesus to pray. Number two, God heard Jesus' prayer. But what's the obvious thing here? God didn't, well, can we say he didn't answer? Or, yeah, Jesus wanted him to. Yeah, that's right. God answered with a no, I guess. But it says, God had the ability to do exactly what Jesus wanted him to do, but he didn't do it. So here we have a great example, I think, of prayer working, prayer being heard in the mind of God, and yet God saying, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. To me, that's encouraging. I mean, it may be discouraging to you, but to me it's really encouraging to know that God hears my prayers, and even when he says no, he's hearing me. What do you think?
You know, Jesus, too, was the only one that could do what God needed done.
That's true.
So he probably, he heard his son, but he wouldn't help him, he wouldn't.
Well, God could not have helped Jesus and do what he did for us, right? And so that's a good point, that aren't we glad God said no? I mean, in a way, we're glad that he said no.
So how much God loves us.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what Paul says in Romans 5. Right? God shows his own love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So God does definitely hear prayers. But then notice he says, secondly, and a lot of people, if you read commentaries, they talk a lot about verse 8 and what in the world it's doing in the middle of this poem. Because verse 8 is about idolatry and how God hates people who worship idols. And it's like, well, why would he just insert that into a prayer about his salvation? Well, what do you think? Let me just let you answer that. What do you think about that? How does verse 8 fit into verses 7 and 9? So I have verse 8 is about the power of prayer. Verse 9 is Jonah's debt of gratitude for God's deliverance. Verse 8 is about down with the idolaters. What's up with that? What do you think?
He may be saying, I'm ready to do what you sent me to do.
Okay, so maybe this is a bit of guilt on Jonah's part, that I've been acting like an idolater and not trusting God. So maybe there's that.
Well, it looks like he's, I'm sorry, it looks like
we're raising our hands. I thought, I'll come back to you. Okay. Oh, go ahead. You said you've been deputized to speak. So.
Sorry. It looks like he's contrasting God with the idols that other people worship. But with God, he does still have the hope of steadfast love, but those people, they don't.
Right. And so he's contrasting the hope that he has now realized in God's deliverance, right, of him, with the, I guess, the hopelessness, let's say, of the idolaters. Okay, that's another good point. Bill, you had...
Oh, that's what I was going to say, but she said it much better than I would
Okay, so you were going to say that same thing too. So who would be the primary idolaters we're thinking of in the book of Jonah? The people of Nineveh. How about that? And so Jonah is starting to, and I think this verse, while a lot of commentators are, and by the way, you'll read some commentators say, well, this verse doesn't even belong in the Bible because they can't make sense of it. They just want to take it out. Somebody put that in there and it doesn't make sense. But I'm thinking this verse is actually the key verse for the book. Because Jonah has moved now from a personal recognition that he was wrong and needs to change to committing himself to doing the will of God. And now he's turning attention outward and saying, all these people are lost. And he knows, of course, he's been commissioned to go to one specific group of people. And so I think that that's really the powerful statement that really transitions us into the second half of the book, is found in verse 8. In Isaiah 44, verses 9 through 11, Jeremiah and Isaiah both talk a lot about the foolishness of worshiping idols. And Isaiah 44 has a lot to say about this. We could read the whole chapter, but verses 9 through 11 is kind of the middle section. All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know, that they might be put to shame. For who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them all assemble, let them stand forth, let them be terrified. They shall be put to shame together. Now, the bigger context talks about how somebody will go out to a forest and they'll say, that's the tree. And then they'll chop down that tree, and then they'll bring it to the craftsman. And he'll sit in his workshop, like Randy could do maybe, and he takes this piece of wood and he works it and fashions it, and it turns into this beautiful statue, and he sets it up, and people say, ooh, wow, what a god. And, they bow down to it, and they worship it, and they pour oil in front of it, and they do all these things to signify this piece of human artistry is God. And Isaiah says, how foolish is that?
Do you think that God caused all this to happen to Jonah to bring him to the realization of this verse 8?
Maybe. Maybe God allowed... We do know that God is controlling these events, right? We talked about one of the big lessons we learned from chapter 1 is God's providence.
Because he didn't think at first they were worth taking the message to.
Apparently not. He tried to run away from God's commission because he didn't want to go to those people. And so, I think that that's right. Now, what's interesting is that Jonah is going to change his mind again in chapter 4, isn't he? Where he's upset that the Ninevites do repent. And that's how the book ends, sadly. We don't know what to make of that.
I figure I better hold my hand up.
Please.
It'd be simpler if they just carved the face on the tree, and when they cut it down, and they have it closer to God anyway, because God created the tree.
Yeah, well, that's true, I guess. I don't know why they cut it down first.
Yeah.
It's easier to decorate, maybe. Yeah.
You mentioned Jonah kind of ends. I know the book of Nahum also talks about kind of the destruction and wrath against Nineveh. Do we know if that takes place before or after the events of Jonah?
So if we follow the 1 Kings 14 chronology of Jonah, then Jonah would date, and we don't exactly know when the book of Nahum is written, but Jonah is probably about 150 years before Nahum. The city of Nineveh is destroyed in 612 BC, and we think, when I say we, I mean other people, not me. People think, who study this, that maybe Nahum was written shortly before the fall of Nineveh. So we don't really know for sure, but Jonah is usually considered well before. That's a good question. Yeah, Corey, do you have something? Yeah, okay. All right, and then Jonah in verse 9 offers this debt of gratitude with these vows and thank offerings. One of the things I want to say is that vows and thank offerings are two sides to the same coin. We don't really do this today, at least not in any sort of official way, but maybe you've heard people sort of say this, well, I made God a promise. Have you ever heard anybody say this? Maybe you've said this yourself. I've known people who really actually meant that. Because most of the time I think people just sort of rather flip it with that kind of statement. Oh, I made God a promise. Okay, well, whatever. But I mean, I've known people who were like, I made God a promise I would not smoke another cigarette, and I have not smoked in 35 years. It's like, oh, well, that's kind of impressive, isn't it? I don't know a lot of people who take those kinds of things seriously. This is a world where when you made a vow, it was like deadly serious. And the way that a vow was fulfilled is whenever the condition that you placed upon the vow came to pass, you would offer a voluntary sacrifice to mark the occasion of your thanksgiving for the fulfillment of this vow. I'll give you an example. So Jacob leaves the land of Canaan, right? In Genesis 28, he leaves the land of Canaan, and he makes God a promise. He said, if you will bring me back to this land in peace, then you'll be my God, and I will serve you all the days of my life, or whatever. And people read that, and they're like, that's kind of flippant of Jacob, because he's saying, if you do everything I want you to do, God, and you make all my dreams come true, and you fulfill all my promises, then I will let you have the honor of being my one and only God. So to a modern reader, that sounds just absolutely ridiculous. And maybe it's a little ridiculous. But it's not as crazy as it seems to us in his time to make those kinds of promises. Jephthah is another example. In Judges chapter 11, Jephthah says, when he's about to kill these enemies, right? He says, if you will deliver me from my enemies, I will offer to you the first thing that meets me when I go home. And what's the first thing that met him? His virgin daughter. And he ends up, people like to debate this, but I think it's fairly clear that he kills her as a sacrifice. And a lot of modern readers, again, you look at that text and you say, why did he kill her? Why didn't he just break his promise to God? I mean, God doesn't really care, really, does he? It's a different world. People take vows deadly seriously at this time period. And I mean deadly in a literal sense. And so that's kind of the context behind this vow and then the thank offering. So when Jonah makes this comment in verse 9, that's the context for it. So Psalm 56 and verse 12, I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. Notice that in this context, vows and thank offerings are related to one another. So just thought I would bring that up. So whenever you read about vows in the Bible, don't think that it's just like somebody saying, well, I promised God this, and they may or may not mean it. These are really serious. Very different than we might think today. It's part of climbing back into the biblical world and trying to understand the way they understood things.
Did God take it very serious back in that day too?
Absolutely, yeah. He did.
He wasn't.
People should not make frivolous vows.
If you lived back then, you wouldn't laugh about it.
No, for sure. One of the things, too, I would say is that there was an age restriction on vows. So I think is this in Numbers 6? Don't quote me on the verse, but I think it's in the book of Numbers, where children cannot make vows on their own. Kids can't make vows because they're not serious enough to keep them. So if their parents vouch for them in the vows, then the parents are bound. It's like co-signing for a loan. You can co-sign for your kids if they make a vow. That's kind of serious, isn't it? Okay, so God communicates to the fish. Verse 10, and the fish spits Jonah out onto dry land, and he starts marching toward Nineveh. All right, so what can we learn from Jonah 2? Here are some lessons. Number one, God's power can reach even into the depths. We saw at the beginning, we talked about this, how it was believed in the ancient world that the power of the gods was limited. So the gods of the land were not necessarily the same gods of the sea. But God proves that his power not only extends both to land and sea, but even into the depths of the sea, as far as to the afterlife itself, so to speak. Number two, the prayers of the righteous do actually work. That God hears prayers and responds to them. And then number three, whenever God has in mind to do something, his mission cannot be contravened. Any comments on any of that? Justin, can we switch to Jonah chapter 3, please? The slides for that. We'll get into this just a little bit. I know we don't have much time here. But let's look at Jonah 3, verses 1 through 3, and we may not finish with this tonight. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. Your versions may have something very different in verse 3. That's a very hard passage to translate. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But notice how verses 1 through 3 has Jonah going to the city of Nineveh. And it's a reminder of the fact that whenever God speaks His word, it will be accomplished one way or the other. My favorite passage in the Old Testament, I think, although ask me tomorrow and that might change, but I think my favorite passage in the Old Testament, at least for the moment, is in Esther chapter 4. You remember where Mordecai says to Esther, and it's not the same verse that a lot of people would think of, like, oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about for such a time as this. That's what you're talking about. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the statement right before that. Whenever he says to Esther that he says the whole point of who knows if you've been in a time such as this is set by the previous statement, which is that God has put you here in a position where you might be able to save the people. But even if you don't, He will figure out some other way to accomplish His will. But who knows if you, and the you is emphatic, have been put here, set here for a time such as this. That's an interesting statement to me because it suggests that they don't know God's plan any more than you and I do. It's not like Esther or Mordecai, either one, have had a dream or a vision or God appeared to them by the oak tree and told them what was going to happen. They didn't know any more about the will of God than you and I do, and yet they trusted that God was going to figure out a way to accomplish His will, whether through Esther or some other means. That's a really powerful lesson to me. Because oftentimes we don't know what God is going to do. And we see that here in Jonah chapter 3. The king of Nineveh has that same attitude. That people today, especially Christians, sometimes act as though God is going to do what they want Him to do. And I'm sorry, but that's just not always the case. And if you expect God is always going to do things exactly the way you want them to be done, get ready for your faith to be wrecked pretty hard someday. Because God just doesn't always do things my way. Sometimes we don't know what God is going to do, but we know this, that His will is going to be accomplished. And so notice in Isaiah 55, God says this explicitly in verse 11. Isaiah 55 and verse 11, about the power of His word. So shall, God says, my word be that goes out of my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. At the beginning of the book of Jonah, God tells him, arise, go to Nineveh. You remember that? In verses 2 and 3 of Jonah chapter 1, arise and go to Nineveh. And then it says, and Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish. Remember that? Command, disobedience. What do we have here in verses 2 and 3? That's right. Arise, go to Nineveh, the exact same commandment from God. Notice this time. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh. And you say, well, that's a minor thing. It's a pretty big deal, though. That last time didn't go so well for Jonah. This time, it's still not going to go so well for Jonah, it looks like. Right? But this is a really important distinction between what happens in verse 1, or in chapter 1, rather, and what happens in chapter 3. And notice the city's importance as well. What do your translations say? I'm going to read a literal, this is how we would perhaps literally render verse 3. Now as for Nineveh, it was a great city to God, a walk of 3 days. Does anybody have a different version than that?
3-day journey in extent.
A 3 days journey in extent, in breadth,
3 days to go through it.
3 days to go through it.
One version says 3 days to see it all.
3 days to see it all. You see how much of a difference there is between these different renderings?
Did you say at first it's a great city? What did you say?
Well, okay, so there are two problems. One is, what does it mean? It is a great, literally it says, a great city to God. Now, what does that mean? Most translations, you translate that as an adverb, an exceedingly great city. Maybe a modern equivalent. Have you ever heard, not that a lot of Christians say this, but have you ever heard somebody say, it was of ungodly proportions? Have you heard anybody say that? Okay, that would be kind of like this. Like it was an ungodly city in proportions. That's what generally modern translations do with that. But that's not at all actually too clear. It's just what everybody does with it. Yes?
My Bible has a footnote for verse 3 that says the exact meaning unknown.
Yeah, that's probably the best statement that one could make about it. But you see, it's my job to puzzle over things like this, so I'm going to continue to puzzle if that's okay. Although we may ultimately say, I don't know. It's good to know why we don't know, maybe. So the first part of it is a great city to God. What does that mean? And the second part is exactly what this is getting at with this 3 days journey or 3 days walk or whatever. So there are 3 different options that you'll find among English translations. One is 3 days in breadth. That is, it's that wide. Now, what does that mean? Well, roughly 45 miles. Okay, so a day's journey, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, was measured at about 15 miles per day. That's about how much a person can walk in a day. Now, professional messengers could double that. And so they can run 30 miles a day, roughly, at least on relatively smooth terrain. But 15 miles a day. Now you say, well, I can't do that. Yeah, but you don't walk every day. I mean, maybe you do, but probably not 15 miles. I mean, you're not walking everywhere. So that's different today. But that's what an average daily distance was considered. So if it's 3 days breadth, that means it's 45 miles wide. Why is that a problem? Because we know of no ancient city that was that large in all of the ancient Near East. Okay, so that's a problem, perhaps, for the believability of this statement. Another option is it's 3 days visit. Now this would be, what did you say, Johnny? You said something like that.
3 days to see it all.
3 days to see it all. So that would be based on this second option. It's a 3 days visit. And there are some people who say, well, there was so much in that city. It was so big and had so many attractions that it took 3 days to go through everything. Okay? Another option is the diplomatic option, where when you went to a city, the first day you announced you were there. The second day you were called upon. And then the third day, they called you back to tell you what the announcement about your case was. Okay? So
This was the city itself, not the surrounding country.
Well, it says the city. Now, the word city doesn't necessarily mean the area within the walls. It could be broader than that. And that's another option. If you want to go with the breadth translation, you don't have to define the area within the city walls. Because we actually have found the walls of Nineveh. So it's not that big.
About 8.5 miles around.
Yeah. And so another option would be the circumference. That's option number 3, is that it's talking about the circumference of the city. It's 45 miles to walk all the way around the area known as Nineveh. But most people who trust the Bible as reliable opt for number 2, that is a 3 days visit. And however we understand that, whether it's a diplomatic interpretation or something like what Johnny said, to see everything took 3 days.
He wasn't just walking straight through. He was proclaiming what God had him to proclaim.
Yeah, so if he's going in every neighborhood and preaching, then, and that seems to be the case because the whole city repents. So he's not just walking straight through yelling out, seemingly. But anyway, I submit to your judgment which one of those is correct. But I know there are a lot of things like, with a lot of people, you can't necessarily move 15 miles a day either. So in a city, can you go 15 miles a day? Probably not. Probably a lot less. So that could help with that too. But this is a well-known problem that some people point to. See, the Bible can't be trusted. It says Nineveh's 3 days journey wide. And we know it wasn't. And I think that that's very easily explained, but that's just me. Okay. I think it's time to stop. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed, and we'll resume with Jonah chapter 3, Lord willing, next. Week after next. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for all the blessings you provide in this life. We ask that you will help us throughout this life to do your will, to not be stubborn like Jonah, but to submit to you immediately and present ourselves willingly for whatever you have in store for us. Be with us as we leave this place today. We ask that you will bless us with safety and health during the holiday season. In Jesus' name, amen.